Welcome, fellow geeks, to the Geek Test. My name is Simon, and this is where we here at Bennett's BikeSocial take a new bike and get geeky with it. On the dyno, performance testing, measuring riding position and ergonomics, weighing it, and not forgetting a ride around the Geek Test route of motorways, A roads, B roads and in town. And the subject of this week's Geek Test is Triumph's Scrambler 400X. Here's a question for you. When was the last time Triumph made a road-going single? The most recent example would be the T20 Tiger Cub, built between 1954 and 1968. It was a 200cc pushrod overhead valve motor in a cute little roadster built to appeal to younger riders and learners who were restricted to sub 250cc bikes after 1960. Triumph also made an off-road trial style version with an upswept exhaust and bigger wheels and longer suspension, and it was called the T20C. But the Tiger Cubs obviously have nothing in common with Triumph's current singles. That's the road-based Speed 400 and the subject of this Geek Test, the Scrambler 400X. Apart from the fact that these bikes are, finally, the modern Triumph factory's entry into the new rider market. And you could say it's about time too. Triumph have flirted with entry-level small bore bikes for well over a decade. Back in 2013, the factory announced a pair of 250cc singles. A fully fed Daytona 250 and a naked street single were repeatedly spy photographed. I counted 3 separate sets of spy photos between the end of 2013 and the start of 2014. Now, the bikes were due for production in 2015 at Triumph's own factory built in India. But only months after the announcement, sometime in 2014, Triumph suddenly canned the whole project, with Triumph's Director of Sales and Marketing, Paul Stroud, saying at the time, "Following a review, we have placed the 250cc bike project on hold for strategic reasons relating to its specific segment." I've got no idea what that means, but it would have been a very expensive write-off. Not just the bike development, but the casting dies, the tooling, but the manufacturing and the production facilities in India as well. Something spooked them big time. And in all probability, it was the realisation that the future of exploiting a market like India, which had bike sales of over 20 million in 2024, it's only possible if it's in partnership with an existing local manufacturer with like domestic production infrastructure already in place. Say, someone like Bajaj, an Indian company, only the 4th largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world. And then there's the product itself. Were a pair of budget small bore versions of Triumph sporty bikes really what anyone wanted? Even in 2014, it was pretty clear the future, particularly in the subcontinent, lay in mining Triumph's history with a retro style. Royal Enfield had successfully been doing just that, hogging 3/4 of the mid-sized bike sales in India, with bikes that were arguably actually vintage, not just vintage style. So everything went quiet for a while, until 2017, when official reports emerged of a tie-up between Triumph and Bajaj. Yes, the same Bajaj who'd owned a stake in KTM since 2014, when Triumph pulled out. That year sounds familiar. Anyway, from that point on, it seemed reasonable to assume the end result would be a Triumph-designed, Bajaj-assembled, entry-level, low to mid-capacity bike, or maybe 2. The only question was when. It actually took until 2020 for the official press release on the tie-up. This is Triumph's Paul Stroud again. He said, quote, "The partnership with Bajaj will enable us to become a bigger brand within the country more quickly. You could be talking about a scenario where Triumph goes from selling 1,200 motorcycles today to volumes north of 1 million units, which is a significant scale. That is the power of this opportunity," end quotes. Anyway, then, presumably, COVID got in the way and we all had other things on our minds for a year or two. But when the world got back to normal, some more spy shots and a spy video emerged in early 2022 of a finished bike. Honestly, you can't ride a top-secret prototype anywhere these days without someone with a camera recording you going backwards and forwards like it's a photo shoot. More scoop shots in 2022 were followed by, finally, and sorry it's taken this long, but imagine you're a young chap in India waiting for Triumph to get their asses in gear. Finally, we got a factory reveal in mid-2023 of a pair of single-cylinder 400s, the road-based Speed 400 with 17-inch wheels and a Scrambler 400X with a 19-inch front, longer travel suspension, a different frame, different steering geometry and Scrambler styling cues. Both bikes were clearly part of the Triumph Modern Classics range, with fake air cooling fins alongside a thoroughly modern motor and chassis. To say they've subsequently sold well is an understatement. Triumph say they sold around 3,000 Speed 400s and Scramblers together in the UK, making them Triumph's best sellers over here. The sales split is about 55% Speed 400 and 45% Scrambler 400X. But that pales in comparison with India. In 2024, they sold nearly 30,000 400s. So to put that in perspective, it's well over 20% of Triumph's global sales of all bikes in 2024. Kerr, as they say, ching. And now, with the sound of all that cash Triumph are making ringing in our ears, we're going to get geeky with the Scrambler 400X. This is going to be refreshingly brief for a number of reasons. For a start, there's only one cylinder to talk about, but it's also because Triumph were unable to supply the Geek Test with any engine diagrams or cutaway photos of the motor, which, to be frank, is a bit odd because it's unusual for a manufacturer to be so reticent when it comes to providing some sort of illustrations to the press. It means two things. It means A, you have to look at some fairly stock footage I took of the outside of the engine while I describe what Triumph say about what's inside the engine. And what's inside could well be made of cheese for all I know. Probably wasn't made of cheese because I gave the bike a proper hammering, and if it was made of cheddar I'd definitely have noticed. But anyway, let's plough on despite Hinckley being backward in coming forward. You'd think they'd be proud of the motor because it is a proper gem. So the engine is a 398cc water-cooled 4-stroke single. It's a bit over square with an 89mm bore and a 64mm stroke, which gives a bore-stroke ratio of 1.391. Now Triumph claim 39.5 bhp at 8,000 rpm and 27.7 pound-foot of torque at 6,500 rpm. As ever, we got Andy to strap our Scrambler 400X to the dyno at BSD Race Developments in I Green, Peterborough, where he did his thing. And the result is 34.6 bhp at 7,700 rpm and 24.3 pound-foot at 6,700 rpm. There's a bit of a slump between 4.5 and 6,000 rpm, but look how close peak torque and peak power are. There's plenty of top end there for a 400cc single. Like the Enfield shotgun, I nearly said Triumph shotgun then, in the last Geek Test, for a classic looking bike, this is a peaky motor. Speaking of the shotgun, just for fun, here it is for comparison. It's kind of like two 324cc singles next to each other. The Enfield motor is 63% larger, makes 51% more torque and 26% more power, in case you're wondering. And do you want to see it against an R1300 GSA, which is two 650cc singles? Of course you do. And now we all know. But for a more sensible comparison, let's pick another single cylinder, say Royal Enfield's equally water-cooled Himalayan. Actually, we haven't got a dyno curve for the Himalayan, but we have got one for the Gorilla, which is the same engine. It's the same claim peak power, same torque figures, so the same revs as the Himalayan, but the Gorilla has a slightly different fueling map, but I don't think it's going to be wildly different, so I think the comparison is still valid, I reckoned. Well, that's a pretty decent leg up over the Scrambler. It's 1-0 to the boys and girls at Bruntingthorpe over the boys and girls at Hinckley. At 452cc, it's 13% larger than the Triumph, but with a much less oversquare 84mm bore and 81.5mm stroke, which gives a lower 1.031 bore-stroke ratio. But look at the difference that extra capacity makes. There ain't no substitute for cubes, as they say in Trumpland. I've not ridden either the Himalayan or the Gorilla, but on the evidence of the graph, I'm pretty sure I'd like them. Another potential rival for the Scrambler might be something like KTM's 390 Adventure, albeit without the modern classic styling. Again, we haven't got a 2025 390 Adventure dyno graph. That has a 398cc motor, same as the Triumph. In fact, funny enough, KTM claim it's 399cc, but an 89mm by 64mm bore and stroke gives 398.15cc. So I don't know, maybe there's some funny accounting or rounding up of numbers going on at KTM. Anyway, conspiracy theory fans are welcome to have a field day with the fact that the 2025 KTM 390 Adventure and the Triumph Scrambler share identical bore and stroke dimensions. That's a coincidence. And they're both assembled by Bajaj. Another coincidence. Actually, in case that really does become a thing, I'm pretty sure one motor was designed in Hinckley and the other motor was designed in Mattighofen. It really is a coincidence, I think. Anyway, whatever. Here's a 390 Adventure. Okay, it's actually a 390 Duke, but I'm pretty sure they're the same thing. Leave a comment down below if I've got that wrong. It's the smallest of the three singles at 373cc, and it's the most over square at 89mm by 60mm, which is a bore stroke ratio of 1.483, which is much higher than the Triumph. And how about that? Look at all those lovely revs, and I said the Triumph was peaky. That's peaky. It's a textbook example of what happens when you go for bore over stroke and torque at high revs. You get loads of top end power, not so much in the bottom end and the mid-range. So, what does all this mean? Luckily for you, I've put all the relevant single-cylinder numbers into a table so we can get a feel for three slightly different routes to designing a 400cc single. And we should bear in mind here that the A2 class limit is 47 bhp and a power to weight limit of 0.26 bhp per kilo. So a 47 bhp engine, the bike that it's in, will have to have a minimum weight of 175 kilos curb, which doesn't sound quite right to me, actually. I read it on the internet, so it must be true. Anyway, you can see all three, Triumph, Enfield and KTM, are pretty close in terms of outright engine performance. The Himalayan makes the most torque because it's the biggest motor, and the KTM revs the hardest because it can. But look at the mean piston speed, which is a function of how far the piston has to travel in the bore, which is the stroke, and how quickly it does it, the revs. So presumably all these engines are safe. Enfield's 21 metres per second, it's not really pushing the limits of piston design, but it is at the higher end of what you'd expect to see in a road-going single. And equally, in this group, the Triumph's little piston has the easiest time of it. So if I were a piston, overall, I'd rather be in the Scrambler, thank you very much. And before you ask, no, the Scrambler's single isn't obviously half of one of Hinckley's many parallel twins, and it's not a third of one of their triples. It's a completely new design. For example, the double overhead cam valve train uses tiny finger follower rockers to open the valves. You normally find them inside high revving inline fours. Here's one I stole earlier from the BMW S1000RR of 2009. As far as I know, this is the only Triumph engine to use them. The single overhead cam, twin-cylinder modern classics like the Bonneville and the Scrambler 1200 use these big-ass finger rockers. Here's a clip of them being adjusted by another Simon on his Songs from the Saddle YouTube channel. Thank you, Simon. So, what's the significance of all this? It means the Scrambler has a modern, high-tech, high-revving, water-cooled engine. We'll get to the price later, but I guess it's the point is we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking this is a budget, low-rent, shoddily assembled engine put together somewhere in a Poundland factory. And it feels a proper unit on the road. It's not just brisk with a bit of, oh bless, it's only a 35 bhp 400. The Scrambler motor is properly usable in any scenario. It's obviously belting in town where the motor is lively and crisp, scooting the Scrambler about with a real zap. True, it's kind of bookended performance. The gearing is so low, first is almost redundant. You boot it pretty much straight into second, and if you're on it, after that you're just throwing gears at the motor until you run out. It feels like it needs a seventh gear. There's no quick shifter option, which is a shame, because if any bike would be more fun with one, it would be the Scrambler. But it doesn't need it. The clutch lever is really light with loads of biting point feel. You can play with it at the lights, sort of flicking it half in and half out and rocking the bike as you listen to a surprisingly loud doffing from the Triumph's twin upswept pipes. On wider, faster roads out in the countryside, well, to be honest, this was the bit of the Geek Test ride I was dreading the most, because this is where my natural bias against single cylinders comes out. Back in the day, road-going four-stroke singles were slow, and deeply unsexy, especially compared to Fireblades and R1s. They were basically for commuting and clearing ditches. But you'd only think that now if you lived in the Stone Age, or the 1990s as we called it at the time. In modern motorcycling world, with modern traffic and speed limits and modern riding styles, and, it must be said, a wider range, a more inclusive range of riders, then all engine styles are relevant and have got a point and a place. You could say modern motorcycling has gone all woke, and it's all the better for it. Maybe diversity is a good thing. Anyway, at a heady 80 miles an hour, with a bit left if you need it, the Scrambler is buzzing along at around 7,500 RPM, mirrors blurring and even folding back against the wind pressure. But the buzzing is those pesky secondary vibes. As a high-revving single with a singular lump of metal flung up and down at great speed, engine balance matters a great deal. Now, as a single, there's a certain amount of tough. It can't be completely balanced for primary vibration. And there's always a compromise. Basically, balance it in one plane and it'll be unbalanced in another. The compromise is to add a counterbalance shaft geared off the crank, usually with something like 50% balance factor for each. It's not perfect. Two balancers at 25% each would be better. But there's all that stuff about weight and packing and power loss to think about. Although it doesn't seem to bother Honda. I think the new GB350 single has twin balancers. Anyway, when we get to secondary balance, which is vibration caused by uneven or non-sinusoidal piston motion, and it's pretty hairy in a single, there's no easy way to balance it out. But, to be honest though, it's kind of hard to tell what sort of vibration it is when you're flat on the tank, bombing down the lanes like an old fighter plane, eyes blurring, everything getting a bit smudgy. But maybe I've focused a bit too much on vibes. The Scrambler motor is actually relatively smooth under normal riding, and it's only after half an hour on constant throttle at motorway speeds where the short top gear gets a bit numbing on the fingers, especially your right hand for some reason. It's funny that. I don't know why, but if you noticed, it's always the right hand mirror that gets more blurry than the left hand mirror, and it's always the right hand that gets more tingly than the left hand. Anyway, at all other times, this is a very civilised, very friendly engine. It's incredibly easy to get on with. It's got no rough edges. It's exactly what it should be for an entry-level bike. And it's got just the right amount of zazz to keep you entertained further into your biking career than it really should. During the Geek Test ride, I was having an absolute blast. It sort of reminded me of riding a scooter. You wind it up, you wring out every last drop of performance from it, and you don't slow down for anything. It's absolutely hilarious, but not in a transient, I'll get bored of it soon way. You won't get bored of this. Anyway, speaking of performance, let's do some speed testing. Here's the best 0 to 60 run I managed, which is pretty easy to get this thing off the line. It even managed a little wheelie, but blimey, you have to grab second gear really quickly. It probably would have been quicker to actually launch the bike in second because of the time you lose changing gear. Anyway, what was I saying about a quick shifter? It makes a bit more sense at half speed. Here you can see you're basically in first gear for 2.4 seconds up to 30 miles an hour, then second gear for another 10 miles an hour up to 40 miles an hour for a second and a half, and then still got to grab third at 55 miles an hour after another 2 seconds. So that's 3 gear changes in 6.96 seconds. But you know what's spooky? Check this out. It's 2 separate launches, both clocking at identical times. How's about that? One thing I'm not noted for is consistency, so I'll take that, cheers. And where does the Scrambler fit into the Geek Test scores table? Well, we've done enough bikes now for actually to start one, so here's what we've got so far. Now that's quite a surprise, because I'd have bet a few quid on the Scrambler actually being a bit nippier than the shotgun. Admittedly, there's not a lot in it. But when we come to top gear roll-on times from 40 to 60 miles an hour, the Scrambler is quicker than the shotgun. The Enfield does it in 6.7 seconds in 151 metres, and the Scrambler in 6.44 seconds in 145 metres. Remember how in the last Geek Test I said the Royal Enfield's top gear felt a bit tall? And now the Scrambler's feels a bit short. Here's the proof. Crikey, it's almost as if we know what we're doing on the Geek Test. Don't worry, only sometimes. Right, I said I was going to be brief. I lied. All that was around 2,500 words. And here are some more. The Scrambler frame is a sort of twin steel tube double cradle, almost fully embracing the motor, with a substantial steel plate bracing around the headstock. As usual, we have no factory illustrations, so here's another lovely low-res parts diagram to look at. Thankfully, the frame isn't overly pixelated in real life, but it does look a bit beefy for a mere 400 single. The frame is 90% the same as the Speed 400, but the Scrambler's headstock plate is some 20mm longer than the Speed's, moving the headstock tube and forks further out. And the Scrambler's is at a slightly steeper steering angle. I also noticed the Scrambler has a deeper top yoke than the Speed, and it's double bolted. The Speed has a single bolt. Added to that, the Scramblers show a big piston forks, which are chunky, unadjustable 43mm upside downers, have 10mm more travel than the Speeds, and the fork bottom is pushed forward of the fork centre line. This is a common trick to reduce trail. It's sort of counterintuitive, but trust me, it really does. At the backs, the Scrambler's got a rather expensive looking aluminium swing arm connected to a preload only Showa rear shock, which has this little compression bottle casting that I thought for a moment might actually be fake. But I prized off this plastic cap and there's a bit of grease in there on a machined surface and there's a bolt head, so it looks like it actually is functional. The subframe is tube steel and it's bolted on, which is another nice touch. The Scrambler runs on cast 19-inch front and a 17-inch rear on Metzler-Carews streets, which are big and lumpy, and are the main reason the Scrambler has a 45mm taller seat height than the Speed at 835mm. Now, that's pretty tall. It's not messing about, and those wheels contribute, I would guess, to largely why Triumph have altered the Scrambler's steering geometry over the Speed. It's got steeper steering angle and more trail, despite the fork differences, because the Scrambler's got much less fork offset than the Speed, which is one of those other counterintuitive things. Less offset gives more trail. So it's also got a longer wheelbase than the Speed, and the chain is also longer, and the rear sprocket is set further back in the adjusters. The extra ride height will give the Scrambler a higher centre of gravity than the Speed as well. I guess another reason for beefing up the headstock and the top yoke is in case the Scrambler actually does get taken off-road and starts getting a battering. In best Geek Test fashion, I kept both wheels as firmly on the tarmac as Lincolnshire County Council's road maintenance budget would allow, which isn't quite as often as I'd like, especially as I've just paid my council tax. Actually, the Scrambler's show of suspension is, excuse the language, bloody amazing at this price point. The front is really well damped, it's planted and controlled on the brakes. The back's not quite as controlled and I found it a bit softer, which probably says more about the heffalump riding it. Triumph really should get some beefier test riders. But the overall result is, again, thinking of the bike's price, surprisingly up spec. The ride quality, the handling control are all superb. There's no cheap choppiness or budget bounciness. I know it's only 40 bhp it's dealing with, but the way the motor encourages you to use that performance really zones in on how the springs react, and they're very, very good. When you plop up and down on the bike at traffic lights, you can feel both ends taking your weight equally with a nice, firm but fair gloopiness. It's a good effort. In town, the Scrambler ducks and dives with the best of them. It's light and flickable, super quick steering, but it's confident too. You just seesaw away at those wide bars and lever the bike about. Weight-wise, on the Geek Test scales, thank you Andy at BISD for helping, the fully fueled Scrambler comes in at 94.9 kilograms rear, 90.9 kilograms front, which is 49% to the front, 51% to the rear. That's a grand total of 185.8 kilograms. The claimed wet weight is 179 kilograms, so it's nearly 7 kilos overweight, I wish. Incidentally, it's also a claimed 9 kilograms heavier than the Speed 400. Speaking of which, during the test, I upped the only suspension adjustment the Scrambler has, winding the rear preload up to max. It's a stepped adjuster, and I couldn't find a C-spanner in what passes for the Scrambler's toolkit, which is just a spanner and a screwdriver. So much for changing the piston at the side of the road. Anyway, maybe there's a C-spanner hidden somewhere else on the bike. Again, let me know in the comments down below. From my extensive C-spanner collection, I found an old Öhlins wrench, which fitted the best, not quite, and used that. It's a stiff old shock for sure. The difference was a bit more propped up on the bike. We'll come to the riding position in a minute. And to be honest, it made the back end feel a bit less supple and a bit more remote to me. I'd probably have the preload somewhere in the middle if I owned the bike. Out on faster A roads, the Scrambler again behaves with a much more composed and frankly expensive feel than it should. Bumps don't throw it off course, it tracks where you point it and it feels secure and confident. It's really, really good. Again, only 40 bhp, but again, with that motor, you can't help riding it like a hoonigan sometimes. Even on the Geek Test's stupidly bumpy road, the Scrambler's 150mm of wheel travel dealt with all the ruts and the split tarmac without tramlining or changing the direction of the bike. It's very impressive. And let's talk about brakes. The Scrambler comes with but one disc at the front, triggering my OCD a bit because it's on the left side of the wheel and I normally film on the right side. Mind you, the chain drive is on the right side and that really triggers me. Anyway, the front disc is 320mm with a 4-pot radial Bibury caliper and the rear is 230mm disc. The lever is unadjustable, but it's a nice shape for wrapping your fingers around and it has plenty of graduated feel. But it's not the sharpest tool in the box. In the braking test, from 60 miles an hour in top to standstill, the Scrambler was a lot easier to get to full pressure than the Enfield shotgun last month. But, and this surprised me, in spite of the Triumph's lack of weight, I could only stop it in 41.2 metres, which is the worst yet on the Geek Test. The shotgun did it in 38 metres. I don't know why it's not better. The brakes don't exactly bite, so maybe different pad material might help. Apparently, this is an internet rumour, so don't quote me, they're organic material and you can swap them with pads from the Speed 400, which are sintered. Either way, there's not a lot of chomp when you want that outright braking power rather than sort of nice gentle pressure. Maybe it's something to do with Triumph tailoring the Scrambler's braking performance to match its intended user, or maybe its use off-road. Anyway, let's crack on. Thanks to its wheels and tyres, the Scrambler feels like a big, proper, solid motorcycle. There isn't a hint of toy about it. And it has a big, proper, solid riding position. Upright, bars are nicely spread apart. They're not too wide, like some adventure bikes where it starts to feel unnatural, like you're paddling a bloody great canoe. I know a lot of riders find wide bars off-putting because when you're at full lock, say going up one of those steep mountain hairpins, you get quite a lot of them out here in the fens. If you're turning left, you might not have enough reach left in your fingers to ride the clutch, so it's nice that the bars aren't daft. After all, the Scrambler is aimed at newer riders and sometimes they don't have the longest of arms. If you must know, it's 8.7 centimetres wider bar end to bar end than a Speed 400. And as I said earlier, it's taller too. 835mm seat height might well limit the kind of rider who can access the bike. I know it's not just about seat height, it's also about the width of the saddle. But the R1300 GSA can go down to 790mm if you have the low seat and the low suspension option. There's neither available for the Scrambler, which seems a bit of an oversight. There is a taller seat option, the quilted comfort seat. It looks even fatter than the stock seat. But for 6-footers, the Scrambler is substantial, with enough room to move around without feeling cramped. The seat's not uncomfortable either. After all day, I was starting to squirm a bit, but I just stopped for a coffee and a stretch. The Scrambler does have some ergonomic quirks though. The first is the foot pegs. There's no other way to describe it than to say they're a bit floppy. They sort of flap about on a weak spring. And when you stand on them, they give by about ½ an inch and feel like they're about to snap. They don't, but it does feel as if the bike is kind of saying, whoa, lay off the pies, mate. Now, you don't need your bike taking cheap shots every time you get on it. You've got a girlfriend for that. The other ergonomic quirk is the side stand. It's 1 inch too long, said no one ever. If you want to kick it up, you have to lean the bike the opposite way, away from you, past the balance point, which I found really, really annoying. It's not as if the bike leans over very far either. It's almost too upright, so you'd think they could knock 1 inch off it. I've got no idea why they made it like that. Maybe the designer is compensating for something. It's got a decent fuel range too. At 44 miles per gallon, measured, the bike was claiming 48 miles per gallon. The 13-litre tank went to 110 miles before I got fuel paranoia. But, as usual on the Geek Test, I was flogging it a bit, and non-Geek Test riding may well push that figure even further, maybe over 150 miles. Whether you'd ever get to Triumph's claim of 80 miles per gallon and 230 miles from the tank seems unlikely to me. Please let me know in the comments below if you've got over 200 miles from a Scrambler, and then tell me how you did it. For its price, the Scrambler is well kitted. You get handguards, nice touch, has switchable traction control, which is also a nice touch. The clocks are pretty good for a Triumph, simple analog style speedo, gear position, tiny little digital tacho, but at least it's got one. A bunch of trip info, including remaining fuel range, which is another nice touch. And the switchgear is pretty plain and simple, but it's not cheap looking. and there's the big crossbar roll made from pleather. All these things contribute to a strong feeling of quality. The Scrambler does not look or feel like a budget bike. It's got the brushed alley number board on one side. The brown seat and the stitching is nicely done. The alley heat shields on the exhaust, the sliding cover on the filler cap, the grille on the headlamp and the beefy headlamp stays and the rubber tank grips. All this stuff just ramps up the attention to detail and raises the Scrambler way past its price point. I should mention too, there's a raft of accessories. Sadly, no heated grips option, but Triumph do a top box, a fly screen, side pannier, bash plate, high front mudguard, engine bars, enough to make the Scrambler really quite a viable, attractive little lightweight touring option. Downsides, well, on our bike, someone had been over keen with a jet wash and lifted the black engine paint all along the edge of the machined fins on the left side of the barrel. I know it's a styling highlight, but I'd be inclined to leave them cast because in the long term, it's just going to be less hassle. So price. Well, it's not news because the bike's been available all through 2024, but you can ride away on a Scrambler 400 for, drumroll please, £5,795, or in PCP world, if you put £800 down as a deposit, it's 79 quid a month for 3 years with £3,000 to find at the end of it. HP payments over the same time and with the same deposit would only be £155 a month, and then the bike's yours at the end of it. Now, how's that compared to its rivals? Well, the first obvious choice is probably the Enfield Himalayan. Bigger motor, smidge more power, but I've not ridden one, so I can't comment on the ride quality or the dynamic of the bike. But in terms of hard cash, it's 5750, so it's pretty much the same as the Scrambler. I spoke to a man with a beard who has ridden the Himalayan and the Scrambler, Mr. Martin Fitzgibbons, don't know who he is, and he said although the spec and the price is the same, they're actually different beasts. The Enfield is like a mini adventure bike, and if you've got any intention of going off-road, get that. But on the road, the Scrambler is better for living with and looking at. He then made a really good suggestion, which is Honda's Scrambler flavoured CL500, a bike I have ridden. It's cheaper than the Scrambler, at $5,500. How do they make them that cheap? It's a parallel twin, so the motor is physically bigger and smoother, and it revs harder, and it has more go in it than the Scrambler. Obviously, it's still inside the 47 bhp A2 power limit, but it's knocking on the door with the claimed 46 bhp. It's a nice bike. It's maybe not quite as detailed as the Triumph, and perhaps it's a bit less charismatic. But anyway, that's quite enough from me, I think. Please remember to like and subscribe, or unlike and unsubscribe. Leave a comment down below. Have you got a Scrambler? Do you like it? Do you agree or disagree with anything I've said? I apologise to any actual mechanical engineers. To Triumph, please, 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 can we have some technical drawings next time? Remember to get your bike insurance from Bennett's, become a BikeSocial member, take advantage of all their offers and money off deals with accessories and clothing and track days, you name it. Visit bikesocial.co.uk/join. Remember to get your motorcycling podcasts from Front End Chatter on Spotify or YouTube or iTunes or even bikesocial.com or even frontendchatter.com. And coming next month on the Geek Test is not one Honda Hornet, but two. We've got Honda's CB1000 and the SP version to get put through the Geek Test mangle. And all that remains for me to say now is thank you very much for watching.